Economic sanctions imposed by Western countries lead to a substantial increase in mortality, comparable to an armed conflict, and they disproportionately hurt children younger than 5 years old. That's according to a new study that analyzed the use of sanctions. Sanctions have been used since ancient times. Some 2,500 years ago, Athens banned all trade with Megara, a city-state allied with Sparta. It was a message that Athens would punish anyone who challenged its authority. But the economic sanctions led to a 27-year war. And that's not the only example of sanctions leading to actual war. Many historians claim the oil embargo the United States imposed on Japan in 1941 factored into the decision by Japanese leaders to attack Pearl Harbor. The United States imposed sanctions against Cuba in the early 1960s after the Cuban government nationalized property owned by American businesses, and then later the U.S. imposed a full economic blockade. The goal, stated by the U.S. State Department, was to alienate internal support for the new government to Fidel Castro. The blockade in place today has contributed to economic problems for the island. After the end of the Cold War, sanctions by Western countries became a commonly used tool of foreign policy. A Washington Post report in 2024 found the U.S. government has imposed sanctions on 1/3 of all countries. Some were successful, like the pressure to end apartheid in South Africa, the sanctions on Libya to hand over the suspects of the Lockerbie bombing, and the sanctions on Serbia that helped bring about Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic's downfall 25 years ago. But according to some studies, only a small percentage of sanctions result in the desired change. And a new study published in The Lancet Global Health points out the harrowing consequences. International sanctions imposed by Western countries can be as deadly as armed conflict, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths every year and disproportionately hurting children. It leaves many wondering if this form of economic coercion should still be used. To discuss the study published in The Lancet Global Health, we have one of its authors, Mark Weisbrot. He is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Mike, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
As I said, you're one of the authors of this study, and the study points out that more than 560,000 deaths each year worldwide result from these sanctions, and as I pointed out as well, it disproportionately impacts children under the age of 5. How did you get to those numbers?
Well, we did a study of 50 years of data, actually, but 152 countries, and it used statistical methods to estimate how many people, how much mortality increased by different age groups. That's why we found, for example, that as a result of the sanctions. So 51% of the deaths, and this was the period 2012 to 2021. The 10 years there, you had 51% of the deaths were children. That's because they get childhood diseases that would normally not kill them, like pneumonia and diarrhea, measles, and so they're the hardest hit. And there's a whole medical literature on that as well. But this was 564,000 people a year died as a result of these sanctions. That was our estimate, and we showed the causality as well, and that is equivalent to about equivalent to all the armed deaths from armed conflict in those years.
Now, according to the Global Sanctions Database, the use of sanctions grew in 1960. At that time, 8% of countries around the world were under some form of sanction. But between 2010 and 2022, that number jumped to 25%. That's 1 in 4 countries, or some studies actually say it's 1 in 3 countries. What's the human impact of these sanctions?
Well, this is huge.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see that the deaths are the biggest things, the mortality. And, you know, this is, I think, one of the reasons it's increased so much is it's a form of economic violence that, first of all, targets the civilian population, which is illegal under the treaties we've signed, the Organization of American States, the Geneva Conventions even, it would be illegal, but it's only, those only apply during war, but it's the same thing, right? If you can't kill civilians when, use collective punishment. That was the prohibition. When you're bombing and shooting each other, it should be a crime also when you're not. So that they can do this, they can get away with it. The war everybody sees. This is, most people don't even know. They think they put sanctions on a country we don't like, and it's just to punish the government. But it really is targeting the civilian population. And members of Congress actually have said that, and they've written letters. 21 people signed a letter asking Biden, for example, to remove, members of Congress asked to remove the sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba in this hemisphere.
And you mentioned a moment ago that many children die because they get diseases which are treatable. They can overcome those diseases, but because of sanctions, they don't have access to, I guess, things like medical care, medicines.
Yes, the food also, and again, they can die from when they're malnourished, and they also lose access. In many cases, they've lost access to electricity, to clean water. In the Venezuelan case is one of the most well documented. I mean, they had the worst depression ever, lost 3 times amount of income or GDP that we lost in the Great Depression. You can imagine that economy, it was destroyed, and the sanctions did most of that.
Now, there was an older study that was done in 1999 which suggested that post-Cold War sanctions may have contributed to more deaths than all weapons of mass destruction throughout history. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, you had 60 million people died in World War II, so I don't think it's that level. But it is, like I said, it's enormous because it is equivalent to armed conflict over the last, the period that we measure, the last 10 years, and that's huge. And nobody knows about, hardly anybody even knows about it, and they can get away with it because people don't know. Most people, if they knew about this, they wouldn't be able to do it.
Right. Now, Bloomberg published an article about your study and interviewed a sanctions lawyer who worked for the United States government. That lawyer was skeptical of your findings in that study, and he said the U.S. government, and I'm quoting him directly, he says, works to ensure that humanitarian groups can work in sanctions countries effectively. I don't know whether that was the case in Iraq, because we know that the Iraqi government told us that 2 million Iraqis died before the U.S. invasion of 2003. But is it your experience that the United States government acts as some kind of benevolent force ensuring that humanitarian aid gets through?
It's just the opposite. And you can look at any of the countries that have had sanctions, and you can ask the humanitarian groups as well. It's just there's too many obstacles. And of course, when a country is under sanctions, a lot of even the banks, if they could get a permit of some sort, and most of the time that's prohibitive, it's too hard to get, they still won't do it because they're afraid what's going to happen to them anyway. So it's sometimes called overcompliance, but that's kind of a euphemism because it is kind of the purpose of the sanctions to do what they're doing. In fact, I mean, I have a quote here from Mike Pompeo in 2019 when he was asked at a press conference about the sanctions in Venezuela, and he said, we wish things could go faster, but I'm very confident that the tide is moving in the direction of the Venezuelan people. It doesn't take much for you to see what's really going on here. The circle is tightening. The humanitarian crisis is increasing by the hour. I talked with our senior person on the ground in Venezuela. You can see the increasing pain and suffering that the Venezuelan people are suffering from. And he's saying that as the sanctions are being successful. And he said the same thing about Iran the same year. And then they stopped saying things like that.
Right. When you listen to language like that, and when you see sanctions being discussed in the media, I mean, it's always in these very abstract terms as well. United Nations resolutions or countries announcing sanctions against another country. But are Western governments really aware of the impact of these sanctions on people?
Well, you can see from Pompeo that they certainly were. And then there's people on the other side as well, the ones who are writing letters to Biden, to put an end to it. They can see that it's targeting civilians. And most people think this is really wrong. It's just indefensible. And I think that's why when it becomes public, it will have to end.
Right, but we have to get to that point when the public is made more aware of what is going on. In fact, you just used the word indefensible. I was looking at a quote, something that you wrote when you said, when the economic violence of broad sanctions becomes widely known, they will be indefensible and no longer politically sustainable. Are we still very far away from that?
I don't know how far. You know, we did have a similar fight where over the U.S. support for the war in Yemen, and in 2019, the Congress did pass, both houses, a war powers resolution that said the executive had to stop funding the war that Saudi Arabia and UAE were leading against Yemen, and they did stop the aerial refueling, and they stopped the bombing of Hodeidah. And so it was an end to a part of an actual sanctions, right? Because people were starving. Okay, so that was done because more senators and members of Congress found out about it, and they took the measure that they had to take. And I think this is possible.
Would it be fair to say, Mark, that the United States is the prime culprit when it comes to the imposition of sanctions? Then, of course, it forces its allies to comply with sanctions as well, as we're seeing right now, where it threatens these countries with secondary sanctions.
No, that's right. Yeah, the United States is the most, well, that's, you know, that's part of the thing that other countries are trying to change as well, right? The United States has this power because it has this special position in the whole international financial system. The dollar is 60% of reserves. Its most international transactions are in dollars. It has control over the IMF, the World Bank, wrote the rules of the WTO. This is so much power, and it's just one country, right? And so you see now the BRICS countries, right? Mm-hmm. They've got 40% of the world's GDP. They got almost half the people of the world, and they're working to create a financial system that won't allow a country, again, with its allies, of course. The U.S. has allies, mostly Europe, but it won't allow one country to determine the fate of humanity.
You know, you used the term economic violence earlier in the interview. Are sanctions war, by another name?
Yeah, they're a form of war. I mean, again, that's why they would be prohibited under the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions were written specifically to allow this part of war that they thought was too horrible for even an all-out war.
Mark Weisbrot, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we are going to take a break. When we come back, we will talk with experts in countries that are being targeted by sanctions. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to The Heat. We are taking a look at the dire effects of economic sanctions around the world. Let's bring in our panelists. From Cuba, Rafael Hernandez is a political scientist, editor of Temas journal, and author of Debating U.S.-Cuban Relations: How Should We Now Play Ball? From Tehran, Akbar Dareini is a researcher and writer at the Strategic Studies of Public Policy journal, and Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. He joins us right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Rafael Hernandez, let me start with you. Thanks for joining us. You join us from Cuba. It's probably the country that has faced more sanctions and for a longer time than any other country. Not just sanctions, there's a blockade in place, and there have been multiple attempts by the United States to overthrow the government as well as assassinate its leaders. But when it comes to sanctions and the blockade, how has it impacted Cuba?
Well, it has had an impact as big as 80% of all Cubans who live in Cuba right now have experienced the embargo. I belong to the tiny minority that remember how Cuba was before the US embargo. The vast majority of Cubans don't know a Cuba without embargo. So we have been suffering that for 66 years, and that has had a consequence, a very heavy consequence on every dimension of human life, on the family economies, on daily transportation, on food availability, on education, on healthcare. Everything has been affected, has been damaged by this powerful weapon, because it has been, as you said, applied and designed as a weapon. It was part of a war that the United States was waging against Cuba between the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the missile crisis in 1962. In February 1962, the embargo was adopted as a law, and the United States administrations, the American administrations, after that, more than 12 American presidents have tightened that embargo.
Ali Akbar Dareini, Iran has faced sanctions since 1979. There was a short break in the early 80s for about 6 years. It's also been bombed more recently by the United States and by Israel. But how has Iran dealt with sanctions over the years?
Iran has been living under sanctions for more than 4 decades, so it has a long experience. But to give you an idea of how sanctions have hurt the Iranian people, according to statistics released by Iran's health ministry, 1,350 Iranian thalassemia patients died in a span of 6 years, from 2018 to 2024. And at least 26 Iranian hemophilia patients died only in 2024, last year. Sanctions is a weapon of mass destruction.
Yeah.
The United States is very much addicted to unilateral sanctions, to waging war of economic terrorism, and resorting to coercive measures against countries it dislikes, and Iran is one of those countries. Research findings in Iran show that while sanctions have constrained Iran's economy, they have incentivized Iran's resilience in finding ways how to defeat the sanctions.
Okay, let's go to Anton Fedyashin. Anton, great to see you. Now, historically, it's been the United States and its allies that have primarily used sanctions to achieve foreign policy goals or to punish those countries that don't comply with their diktats. But when you review the use of sanctions over the decades, have they worked?
Anna, that's a great question. It depends on what country is being sanctioned. So the smaller economies of the world have certainly come under enormous economic pressure. Cuba is one of these examples, of course, as we just heard. Iran is another, the DPRK, North Korea, and there have been other examples. So they've certainly left an economic impact, but the proof for their actually changing policies is almost non-existent. As a matter of fact, people usually are limited to using apartheid-era South Africa as an example of sanctions changing a country's policies. And outside of that, they haven't had much of an effect. And we're living through sanctions today on multiple countries. And they don't seem to be working at all. Quite the contrary, I'd argue that the blowback has been much more serious for those who impose sanctions than they've actually achieved their intended goals.
Right, and Anton, those imposing sanctions often say they're being done for a specific purpose. I mean, if we look at the case of Cuba, it's for regime change in Cuba. I mean, one could say the same for Iran, although sanctions are also being used against Iran to try and force Iran to stop its and cease its civilian nuclear program. Russia faces sanctions, and it started facing these sanctions after the annexation of Crimea. But a study shows that these sanctions only work 25% of the time. So why do you think they're still being used? Is this just about control, about Western domination?
Well, it's about hegemony. It's about the West acting as a legislative civilization. That term has been used by political scientists to refer to countries who essentially lay down the laws, sometimes understood and unspoken, by which different civilizations, different historical periods, rather, have functioned. And of course, over the past century, roughly, it's been the United States and its allies that have laid down the fundamental laws and assumptions by which international politics have worked. And over the past 30 years, we've been going through a tectonic shift on our planet, whereby the non-Western nations are slowly emerging as powerful economies, and they simply won't take the Western diktat as law. They are beginning to resist. And sanctions is the old 20th century and actually also 19th century tool to force those countries to do what the West wants. They are more a sign of declining hegemony and the declining status as legislative nations than they are of anything else. And as we're seeing now, the sanctions are certainly piling up, but their effects are shrinking with time.
Rafael Hernandez, one wonders sometimes how these policy decisions are made. I mean, look at Cuba as an example again. It was placed on a United States list of state sponsors of terrorism for hosting members of the Colombian groups FARC and ELN. But according to the Colombian president himself, Gustavo Petro, he said Colombia itself, in cooperation with the Obama government in Washington, asked Cuba to host these groups as part of the peace process. How does one explain this? It appears to be more evidence of Western duplicity. Things change from one time to another.
Well, I think that it is impossible to understand the long-lasting embargo against Cuba if we think that it's just a consequence of something Cuba did, which is the revolution. It is part of a domination project, of a hegemonic project the United States is implementing towards Cuba since the end of the 19th century. And this is part of that long history, a long history that has to do with geopolitics, that has to do with a very close neighbor. They wanted to be at some point part of the American Union. This is part of the theory of the ripe fruit. Cuba should be part of the United States. And if Cuba is not an American state, it is not part of the Union, Cuba must be like aligned with the United States policy. And that lasted until 1959. In 1959, the land reform, that was the first reform implemented by the Cuban Revolution, that nothing to do with socialism, nothing to do with the Communist Party, nothing to do with the Soviet alliance. It had to do simply with modernization and with justice, with social justice. At that point, US sanctions, US pressures against Cuba started. So the idea that they needed to justify the embargo later was not about only changing the Cuban system. As a matter of fact, the two main objections to Cuba, to the Cuban Revolution by the United States through the Cold War, was Cuba was a Soviet ally and Cuba was supporting the revolution because Cuba was sending troops or support to Africa or was supporting liberation movements. But that is not happening. After 1991, there's no Soviet Union, there's no Cuban troops in Africa, there's nothing that has to do with that. And then the justification may be anything. The justification about the terrorist list is something that the European countries don't share. The European allies of the United States are not simply supporting the idea of Cuba as part of a list of terrorist states.
Right.
They are against the embargo. They are against the embargo, and they are against the terrorist label imposed on Cuba. They are opposing that.
Anton, we see sanctions being used in all kinds of ways right now. I mean, the United States is threatening to impose sanctions on Brazil because its courts have prosecuted a former president who is an ally of the current president of the United States, Donald Trump. What do you make of this overt interference in the internal affairs of another country?
Anand, this is the way that the United States tries to make other countries do what the current administration expects them to do. Sanctions are, in the broadest sense, a coping mechanism with the loss of American influence in the world. 30 years ago, the United States could simply move a little finger and things sort of fell into place. And those days are gone, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for the Americans to come to terms with this. What we're seeing under the Trump administration is certainly an acute manifestation of the use of both sanctions and of tariffs, and the complete sort of disappearance of any distinction between them. But this didn't start with the Trump administration. The Biden administration, for example, kept the tariffs that the first Trump administration imposed on China. They kept them in place. The Obama administration certainly started using sanctions. So this is a way to basically impose American will on the rest of the world. And the U.S. certainly isn't the first country to do this. Great powers have always done it. The U.S. did it to Japan in the middle of the 20th century. Look, Napoleon's continental system, the blockade of the European continent, was a form of sanctioning the Brits, essentially isolating them. This in itself is nothing new, but what is a sea change that we're living through right now is that the countries that are being sanctioned or tariffed are actually banding together. And this is something that we haven't seen in a century, and this is what is going to create a massive change to the geoeconomic structure of our planet as it begins to separate into two camps. One, the Western one, and then the other, everyone else with different regional networks of trading in local currencies, which is going to be a very big problem for the US dollar, because the 21st century has inherited the 20th century tradition of the dollar being the international reserve currency and the currency of trade. And that status is about to evaporate.
Rafael, we just have about a minute left, but I want to get your view on something that the sanctions expert Nicholas Mulder said. He said sanctions have their origins in economic warfare strategies aimed at starving civilians. Has that been the case in Cuba?
It is exactly. It has been documented in declassified papers, in US declassified papers in 1960, 61, 62, that the idea was to use starvation as a weapon to push Cubans out of Cuba, to make a lot of Cubans leave the country, and to weaken the resistance of the revolution. That is exactly my point. It is a weapon. It is an instrument of war, a war that has been there for 63 years.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to both of you for joining us, and our apologies. We lost Ali Akbar Dareini, our Tehran guest, thanks to some technical problems. We need to leave it there. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.